In the quiet neighborhoods of Queens, New York, there lived a man who made stealing look like art and hurting friends seem like business. James Burke, known in the crime world as Jimmy the Gent, was like two different people in one. He was a man who could order someone to be killed with the same nice smile he used to wish your mom a happy birthday. He was charming enough to make tough criminals loyal to him, but also cruel enough to kill them without thinking twice when they became a problem. Before we get into the crazy world of Jimmy the Gent, let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. This story gets more and more scary, so make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. Give this video a like if you are ready to learn all about one of America's most famous criminal minds. And stay with me. This is not just a story. It is a great lesson in how having too much power can make a person bad. It really can. This is not just another crime story. This is the complete story of how a child with no family became one of America's most famous criminal planners. He planned the biggest cash robbery in American history, and at the same time, destroyed everyone who helped him do it. Burke's story is a perfect example of how power can make someone completely bad, how being loyal can be used to hurt people, and how the same success that builds a kingdom can also be the poison that tears it down. What makes Jimmy Burke's story so scary is not just how big his crimes were, but the very careful and exact way he got rid of anyone who was even a tiny bit of a danger to his freedom. After the famous Lufthansa Heist of 1978, he did not celebrate. He started killing. One by one, his partners in the biggest robbery in American history started to disappear. Their bodies were found all over New York, like playing cards thrown away from a high-stakes game that went wrong. But Burke's story starts long before the bright lights of JFK Airport and the shiny storage areas full of cash that could not be traced. It starts in the sadness of being left alone, in the cold hallways of special schools, and in the hard lessons that taught a young boy that the only person he could trust was himself. And even that trust would turn out to be dangerous. James Burke was born on July 5, 1931, in New York City, but it seemed like the world wanted to push him away from the very beginning. He was born to Irish-American parents who did not see their son as a gift, but as a problem. Burke's first memories were not of bedtime stories or family dinners, but of doors closing, voices going away, and slowly understanding that he was alone in a world that did not owe him anything. His parents leaving him was not a big, sudden event. There was no happy goodbye or reason that a young kid could understand. Instead, it was a slow fading away, like sugar melting in bitter coffee. First, his father stopped coming home for dinner. Then, he stopped coming home at all. His mother, who was tired and maybe sad because of her own problems, just walked away one cold morning when Jimmy was barely old enough to understand what forever meant. The foster care system in 1930s New York was not made to help kids heal. It was made for storing them. Young Jimmy was moved from one temporary home to another. Each move taught him that friendships with people were weak things that could be broken without any warning or reason. In some homes, he was treated like a guest who was not wanted. In others, he was completely ignored. In the worst ones, he learned that trusting people was a special treat he could not have. By the time he was 10, Burke had built an emotional shield that would shape the rest of his life. He learned to be charming when he had to be scary when he could be, and to never, ever count on anyone else to survive. These were not choices a child thought about making. They were natural changes he made to get by. It was the way a young mind grew to survive in a mean world. The special schools that became Burke's main education were mean places that taught boys how to be criminals. Elmira Reformatory, where Burke spent some of his most important years, was less about helping boys change and more about punishing them. The boys who lived there learned to fight, to make secret plans, to make friends, and to betray those friends when they needed to. It was a small version of the criminal world Burke would one day rule, with its own leaders, rules, and punishments for being weak. In these places, Burke found out he was a natural leader, but not the kind they teach in books. He could understand people, knowing their fears and what they wanted with a skill that was both amazing and spooky. He learned to show different sides of himself to different people, respectful to people in charge when it helped him, scary to those who challenged him, and very charming to those he needed to trick. One story from his time at Elmira shows the two different sides that would define Burke for the rest of his life. When a younger boy was being picked on all the time by older kids, Burke stepped in to stop it. But he did not do it because he felt sorry for the boy. It was a smart move to make the younger boy loyal to him, and at the same time, show his power to the bullies. The boy he saved became one of his first loyal followers, and the bullies learned to respect Burke's power. Even when he seemed to be kind, he was really just planning for his future power. Burke's first big trouble with the law happened when he was 16, when he was arrested for breaking into a place. The crime itself was small. He had stolen some things from a local store, but how he acted when he was arrested and questioned showed the smart criminal mind that was already growing. He showed no sadness, felt no fear of being punished, and treated the whole thing like a learning lesson. The police officer who arrested him, Detective William Morrison, later remembered that Burke was not like any other young criminal he had ever met. Most kids that age, when they get caught, they cry or they get angry or they try to make excuses, Morrison said years later. But Burke studied us. He watched how we worked, how we asked him questions, how we moved him through the system. It was like he was taking notes for later. Morrison's thought was more ripe than he could have known. Burke was really studying the system, learning its weak spots with the same focus that other teenagers used for learning to drive or asking someone to a school dance. Every time he dealt with the police, it became a class in how to be a criminal. When he was let out, Burke went back to the streets of Queens with a new understanding of both his chances and the dangers. The neighborhood had changed while he was away. World War II had ended, jobs were changing, and new types of organized crime groups were showing up to take the place of the old gangs. Burke saw these changes as chances to build something bigger than the small stealing and street fighting he did as a teenager. It was during this time that Burke met Henry Hill, a meeting that would be very important for both of their lives, and in the end, would destroy one of them. Hill was younger than Burke and came from a better family, but he was excited about the criminal life in a way that impressed the more experienced Burke. While Burke's criminal side was born from need and hard times, Hill seemed to come from just being fascinated with the life of an outlaw. Their partnership started with small tricks and minor stealing, but Burke quickly saw that Hill had skills that went perfectly with his own. Hill was naturally friendly and charming in a way that made people feel comfortable. While Burke's charm was more planned and scary, Hill could get information and make friends, while Burke could plan crimes and keep everyone in line. Together, they started working at the airports, truck stops, and big storage buildings of Queens and Brooklyn, learning the patterns of business and finding chances to steal. But these were not just random smash-and-grab jobs. With Burke leading, they created planned ways to rob that made the risk low and the money high. Burke's reputation during this time was that of a young man who was dangerous but fair when dealing with other criminals. He paid what he owed, kept his promises when it helped him, and punished anyone who betrayed him quickly, and in a way, people would remember. He carefully built this reputation. Burke understood that in the criminal world, what people think of you was often more important than the truth. One early event that helped build Burke's reputation involved a fight with an older, more powerful criminal who had cheated Burke out of his share of a robbery. Instead of getting violent right away, Burke waited 3 months, carefully studying his target's habits and daily plans. When he finally did something, it was shockingly fast and effective. The man was found beaten almost to death in his own garage, with a note pinned to his jacket that just said, "Debts paid in full." The message was clear to anyone in the criminal world who heard the story. Jimmy Burke was not someone to mess with, and he had the patience and smarts to make his revenge happen for sure, and in a way people would remember. This event was the start of Burke's reputation as someone who mixed the cruelty of a street criminal with the smart planning of a general. Burke's change from a lone criminal to a partner of organized crime started through his friendship with the Lucchese crime family, one of New York's 5 big Mafia groups. This was not a sudden hiring, but a slow joining that happened over several years, as Burke proved. He was valuable and trustworthy to more and more important members of the group. The connection came through Paul Vario, a captain in the Lucchese family who controlled much of the crime in Burke's neighborhood. Vario was impressed by Burke's smarts and his skill at organizing things, but more importantly, he knew that Burke's Irish background meant he could never become a made member of the Italian-led Mafia. This rule made Burke useful, but also easy to control. He could handle jobs that needed smarts and leadership, but he could never be a real danger to Vario's spot in the family's power structure. Burke understood this situation perfectly and used it to help himself. As an Irish partner instead of an Italian member, he did not have to follow many of the old rules that Mafia members had to follow. He could work with more freedom than full members could, while still getting the protection and help that came with being tied to the family. With Vario's help, Burke started to grow his work from simple stealing to more complex crime businesses. He learned about loan sharking, where money was loaned at very high prices to people who were desperate and had no legal way to fight back when they could not pay. He studied the numbers racket, an illegal betting game that took bets on number-based results like stock prices or horse race results. Most importantly, he began to understand the complicated network of cheating and bribery that let organized crime grow in New York. This was not a formal, planned education. It was learned by watching, doing, and sometimes making painful mistakes. Burke watched how experienced criminals dealt with crooked police officers, judges, and politicians. He learned the careful art of offering bribes that were big enough to get help, but small enough to not get too much attention. He studied the ways they used to scare witnesses, change who was on a jury, and mess with court cases. Maybe most importantly, Burke learned to think like a businessman instead of just a criminal. Crime, he realized, was just another type of business with its own ways of getting things, its own customers, and its own competition. To succeed, you needed the same smart planning, good work, and customer service skills that real businesses used, but with the extra challenge of avoiding the police and dealing with the danger of violence from other criminals. By his early 20s, Burke had changed from a lonely child, bouncing between special schools, into a smart criminal with friends all over the New York crime world. But this change had a price that would not be clear until much later. In learning how to survive and do well in a world built on violence and betrayal, Burke had slowly lost his ability to have real friendships. The charm and loyalty he showed were tools, not real feelings. And the friendships he built were business deals, not real friendships. Not feeling emotions would one day become both Burke's biggest strength and his biggest weakness. It let him make the cold, smart decisions needed to build a criminal kingdom. But it also made it possible for him to destroy that kingdom by getting rid of the very people who had helped him build it. The stage was set for Burke's rise to power, but the seeds of his eventual fall had already been planted in the sad soil of his lonely childhood and his tough teenage years in special schools. The man who would become known as Jimmy the Gent was ready to start building his name, not knowing that every step toward power was also a step toward the fear and loneliness that would one day take over his life. By the early 1950s, Jimmy Burke had found his special place in the crime world of New York. It was stealing cargo from John F. Kennedy Airport, which was then called Idlewild Airport. What started as just taking chances to steal things slowly turned into a smart operation that would make Burke one of the most successful hijackers in American crime history. A strong economy after the war had turned America's airports into rivers of valuable things flowing in easy-to-predict ways. Every day, millions of dollars worth of goods moved through JFK's cargo buildings. Electronics from Asia, fancy items. From Europe, expensive clothing, jewelry, and bigger shipments of cash from banks and armored trucks. To Burke's smart mind, this was an almost endless supply of money, if it was planned and done right. Burke's way of stealing from the airport was new because of how planned it was. Instead of just grabbing whatever looked valuable, he spent time and money to understand the whole cargo operation. He studied airline schedules, learned the daily plans of security guards, found the weakest spots in the cargo handling process, and most importantly, started hiring secret helpers from inside the airport workers. This last part, inside information, became the most important part of Burke's operation. He understood that to steal successfully, he needed to know ahead of time about valuable shipments, security rules, and timing. Instead of hoping for luck or random chances, Burke built a network of airport workers who gave him detailed information about valuable cargo in return for regular payments. Hiring these secret helpers was done with the same careful attention to people's minds that Burke used in all his criminal work. He found workers with money problems, personal weaknesses, or who were angry at their bosses. He approached them, not as a criminal looking for partners in crime, but as a friendly neighborhood businessman offering deals that would help both of them. Louis Werner, a Lufthansa cargo supervisor who would later be a key part of Burke's most famous heist, was a typical person for Burke to hire. Werner had gambling debts, a lifestyle that cost more than his real job paid, and was getting angrier about his company's security rules. When Burke first met him, it was not with an offer to join a robbery, but with a friendly chat about Werner's interests and problems. Over several months, Burke slowly pulled Werner into his world. He offered small loans when Werner was low on cash, introduced him to better gambling places, and generally acted like a successful businessman who understood Werner's unhappiness with the normal world. By the time Werner realized he was working for one of New York's smartest criminal groups, he was so deep in it with money and feelings that getting out seemed impossible. This patient, step-by-step way of hiring helpers allowed Burke to build an information network that reached all over JFK Airport. He had helpers in cargo handling, security, office work, and even some airline offices. This network gave him early warnings of valuable shipments, detailed knowledge of security rules, and early heads-ups about any police interest in his work. Burke's hijacking jobs were known for being exact and having very little violence. Unlike many criminals who used fear and meanness, Burke liked to do thefts so smoothly that victims often did not realize they had been robbed until hours or even days later. His teams would stop cargo trucks at planned spots, move the goods to clean cars, and disappear into the maze of Queens and Brooklyn streets before anyone knew anything was wrong. The stolen goods from these thefts were moved through a sales network that Burke had carefully built over several years. Instead of trying to sell stolen things himself, he made friends with real businesses that were willing to buy good quality items without asking too many questions about where they came from. This method let him move large amounts of stolen goods quickly and for good prices, while keeping himself away from the police as much as possible. Burke's reputation in the criminal world during this time was that of a professional who could get things done without extra trouble. Other criminals started coming to him for partnerships, hoping to get help from his organization and skills. But Burke was picky about who he worked with, choosing partners based on their skills, how much he could trust them, and their ability to follow his carefully planned rules for jobs. It was during this time that Burke got the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his criminal life, Jimmy the Gent. The nickname showed a side of Burke's personality that made him different from other criminals of his time. It was his ability to do even the most serious criminal business with a polite and high, professional style that was both relaxing and scary. Burke's version of being a gentleman did not come from real kindness or respect for others. Instead, it was a carefully planned tool that he used to create certain feelings in people's minds. His politeness made people not realize how violent he could be. His seeming reasonableness made his threats more frightening, and his professional style helped him build the trust he needed to do complicated criminal jobs. A typical example of Burke's style could be seen in how he dealt with robbery victims. Unlike criminals who used fear and threats to control their targets, Burke often treated robbery like a business deal. He would explain to victims exactly what was happening, promise them that they would not be hurt if they did what he said, and sometimes even say sorry for the trouble he was causing them. This way of doing things had several real purposes, besides just messing with people's minds. Calm, cooperative victims were less likely to fight back, less likely to remember specific details that might help the police, and more likely to wait before reporting the crime. Burke understood that terror could cause problems. A terrified victim might do something unexpected or brave, while a victim who believed they were dealing with a reasonable professional was more likely to just do what they were told quietly. But Burke's gentlemanly act hid a side that was capable of extreme violence, which he was perfectly willing to use when he had to. Those who broke his trust, threatened his jobs, or showed disrespect for his power learned quickly that his politeness was a special treat that could be taken away without warning. One story from this time shows both Burke's gentlemanly reputation and his willingness to drop it when needed. A small-time criminal named Tony Cafaro had been spreading rumors that Burke was working with the police, a very dangerous thing to say in the world of organized crime. Instead of reacting right away with violence, Burke set up a meeting with Cafaro at a quiet restaurant in Queens. According to people who were there, Burke spent the first hour of the meeting treating Cafaro like an old friend, buying him drinks, asking about his family, and talking about people they both knew in the neighborhood. The conversation was so pleasant that other people eating there later told police they thought the two men were just having a normal business meeting. Then, as dessert was being served, Burke's attitude changed completely. Without raising his voice or changing his pleasant face, he explained to Cafaro exactly what would happen to him if the rumors kept going. He described in calm, detailed words how Cafaro would be killed, how his body would be gotten rid of, and what would happen to anyone who tried to find out what happened to him. The change was so complete and so scary that Cafaro, even though he was an experienced criminal himself, was reportedly shaking by the time Burke finished talking. But Burke was not finished. He then went back to his old friendly self, finished his dessert, paid the bill with a big tip, and wished Cafaro a nice evening. As they left, the rumors about Burke stopped immediately, and Cafaro moved to Florida within a month. This story became part of Burke's legend in criminal groups. It showed that his reputation for being a gentleman made his ability to be violent even more frightening than if he had just been a normal tough guy. Burke's success as a hijacker had made him rich for a criminal, but being rich was not his final goal. Like many successful criminals, he understood that a person's success is weak and does not last and is napped up by a larger group. Throughout the 1960s, Burke carefully built a criminal group that made him more powerful, gave him more abilities, and gave him layers of protection from the police. The heart of Burke's group was made of a carefully chosen team of career criminals who shared his belief in being professional and his planned way of stealing. These were not desperate beginners looking for a quick payday. but experienced professionals who understood that their long-term success depended on careful planning, discipline during jobs, and total loyalty to Burke's leadership. Henry Hill stayed Burke's closest partner and most trusted friend during this time. Hill's natural charm and social skills made him a perfect person to hire new people and gather information. And his real admiration for Burke's smart planning made sure he was loyal. Hill handled a lot of the day-to-day running of Burke's jobs, which let Burke focus on big-picture planning and keeping up friendships with higher-level organized crime members. Tommy DeSimone, another key member of Burke's crew, was the violent force that was needed for any successful criminal group. DeSimone was younger than Burke and Hill, but his reputation for sudden violence made him a useful tool when threats were needed. Burke used him carefully, understanding that violence that was not controlled could bring unwanted attention from the police, but also knowing that the threat of violence was needed to keep his group in line. The friendship between Burke and DeSimone showed Burke's smart understanding of how criminals think. DeSimone was truly violent and unpredictable, which made him both useful and dangerous to Burke's group. Burke managed this friendship by giving DeSimone carefully controlled chances to be violent, while making sure that this violence helped Burke's plans instead of creating extra problems. Burke's group also included a network of specialists who brought specific skills and services needed for complicated criminal jobs. These included drivers who could get around the complex highway system around New York airports, mechanics who could change cars for specific criminal needs, and fences who could quickly turn stolen goods into cash. Most importantly, Burke kept friendships with crooked officials who could give him early warnings of police investigations and, when needed, change what happened in court cases. The network of crooked officials that Burke built was very smart and showed his deep understanding of how government systems really work. Instead of trying to bribe high-level officials who were watched closely and hard to get to, Burke focused on middle-level workers who had access to useful information but were not seen as important enough to get a lot of security checks. A typical example was Burke's friendship with Detective Daniel Mann of the New York Police Department's Property Crimes Division. Mann was not a top detective or a decision-maker in the department, but his job gave him access to information about ongoing investigations, planned police actions, and messages between departments. Burke carefully built a friendship with Mann over several years, giving him regular payments, occasional gifts, and most importantly, information about criminals outside Burke's group that Mann could use to make himself look good in the police department. This friendship was helpful to both of them in ways that went beyond simple bribery. Mann gave Burke early warnings of police actions, but he also acted as a way for Burke to guide what the police focused on. When Burke wanted police to look away from his own jobs, he would give Mann information about other criminals that would give the police other people to investigate. Burke's network of crooked officials went beyond the police and into the court system, government agencies, and even some real businesses that acted as covers for his criminal jobs. This network was not kept together by fear or violence alone, but by a careful system of helping each other that made working together better than fighting back. By the late 1960s, Burke had changed from a single criminal into the leader of a smart group that made millions of dollars a year through planned theft. His jobs were known for being professional, smart, and for their amazing ability to avoid serious trouble with the police. But this success was built on friendships and loyalties that were just business deals, not real. And the same good work that made Burke's group successful would one day become the tool he used to destroy it. Burke's place in the New York criminal world during the 1960s was special and carefully kept. As an Irish-American partner of the Lucchese crime family, he was in a middle spot that gave him a lot of freedom to work while keeping him forever out of the highest levels of organized crime power. This position was perfect for Burke. He was not interested in the special ceremonies of being in the Mafia, and being left out of the official group actually made him more valuable to them. Paul Vario, Burke's main connection to the Lucchese family, saw that Burke's background and outsider status made him perfect for certain kinds of jobs that would be hard or wrong for made members of the group to do. Burke could work with Irish, Jewish, and other non-Italian criminals without breaking old Mafia rules. He could do things that might be seen as beneath made members, and he could be given up to the police if needed without hurting the main structure of the family. Burke understood this situation and used it to his advantage. He accepted his place as a permanent outsider, while at the same time making himself a necessity through his ability to make money and solve problems that other members of the group could not handle. His airport hijacking jobs brought in steady money for the Lucchese family, while his organizing skills made him valuable for planning and doing complicated criminal jobs. The friendship between Burke and the official Mafia group was kept through a careful system of paying tribute, sharing opportunities, and respecting each other. Burke paid a part of his earnings to Vario, who passed a piece of it up the chain of command in the Lucchese family. In return, Burke got protection from other criminal groups, help when dealing with police problems, and access to criminal chances that needed the support of a major crime family. But Burke's friendship with organized crime was not just about him being bossed around. His success and reputation gave him power in the criminal world that he used to slowly grow his influence and freedom. Other crime families started coming to Burke directly for partnerships and services, seeing that his skills and organization could be useful for their own jobs. This growth of Burke's influence created a tricky balancing act that needed careful political moves. Burke needed to stay loyal to the Lucchese family, while at the same time building friendships with other criminal groups. He had to seem thankful for the protection and chances given by his Mafia connections, while also showing that he was successful and valuable enough to be respected and independent. Burke handled this balance with a mix of smooth talking, smart generosity, and occasional shows of strength. He shared profitable chances with members of different crime families, making sure that his success helped the whole criminal world instead of threatening it. He provided services and help to other criminals without expecting anything back right away, building a network of friendships that he could use when needed. And when he had to, he showed through controlled uses of violence that he was not someone who could be taken advantage of, even though he was an outsider. One story from this time shows Burke's smart understanding of criminal politics. When a member of the Gambino crime family tried to force his way into one of Burke's airport jobs, Burke faced a tricky situation that needed careful handling. A direct fight with the Gambinos could have turned into a bigger conflict that would have hurt Burke's friendships all over the criminal world. But letting the person in would have damaged his reputation and led to more challenges to his power. Burke's solution was typically sneaky and effective. Instead of facing the Gambino soldier directly, Burke arranged for the man to be offered a partnership in a different, seemingly more profitable job. This job was actually a trap that led to the man's arrest by the police on charges that had nothing to do with Burke's work. The Gambino soldier was removed from the picture without Burke having to use violence or a direct fight, and the problem was solved in a way that actually made Burke's reputation for being smart and careful even better. By the end of the 1960s, Burke had made himself one of New York's most successful and respected independent criminals. His jobs made millions of dollars a year. His group was filled with experienced professionals, and his reputation for being smart and reliable had made him a valuable partner for criminal groups all over the area. But Burke's success had also created hopes and pressures that would eventually lead him to the biggest and most dangerous job of his career. The stage was set for the Lufthansa Heist, the crime that would make Burke famous, and in the end, destroy everything he had spent 20 years building. But before looking at that key moment, it is important to understand that Burke's success during The 1960s was not just because of criminal skill or luck. It was the result of a smart understanding of people's minds, how groups work, and strategic planning that would have made him successful in any job he chose to do. The sad part of Jimmy Burke's story is not that he was a naturally evil man who chose crime, but that he was a naturally brilliant man whose early life had taught him that the only way to survive was to never trust anyone completely, including, in the end, himself. By 1978, Jimmy Burke had spent almost 30 years perfecting the art of stealing from airports. But he had never seen a chance quite like the one that Louis Werner showed him that fall. Werner, the Lufthansa cargo supervisor who's hiring Burke, had carefully planned years before, brought information about a shipment that would be much bigger than any previous robbery in American crime history. The details were almost too good to be true. About $6 million in cash and jewelry was sitting in the Lufthansa cargo building at JFK Airport over the Thanksgiving weekend. The money was mostly bills that could not be traced, being returned to American banks from West German banks, along with a collection of valuable jewelry and precious metals. It would be stored in a building with relatively light security during a holiday weekend when there would be few guards, and it would take longer for help to arrive. But Burke's first reaction to Werner's information was not excitement. It was suspicion. A chance this big and seemingly easy was exactly the kind of trap that the police might use to catch smart criminals. Burke had survived almost 30 years in the criminal business by being paranoid about chances that seemed too good to be true. And this one set off every alarm bell in his experienced criminal mind. Burke spent several weeks checking Werner's information through other sources, double-checking details with other helpers inside the airport, and looking for any signs that the chance might be a police trap. His investigation showed that the information was correct, but it also confirmed that doing a heist this big would need more resources and planning than anything he had tried before. The physical challenges alone were huge. The Lufthansa cargo building was bigger and more heavily guarded than the places Burke usually targeted. The amount of cash involved would need multiple cars and more men to move it. Most importantly, a theft this big would create a police response bigger than ever before, which could possibly expose Burke's whole group to investigation and arrest. But Burke's analysis also showed advantages that made the heist possible even with its risks. The holiday weekend timing would mean fewer workers and security guards would be there during the robbery. The location of the cash inside the building was reachable through paths that Werner could help them navigate. And Burke's years of experience with airport security had given him detailed knowledge of what to do in response and possible escape routes. Maybe most importantly, Burke knew that a chance this big might never come up again. His criminal career had been built on a series of bigger and bigger thefts, each one building on the knowledge and resources he got from past jobs. The Lufthansa heist was the natural final step of everything he had learned about airport theft, criminal organization, and planning jobs. Burke's decision to go ahead with the heist was made with full knowledge of its risks and possible outcomes. He understood that success would make him one of the most wanted criminals in America, while failure could mean life in prison or death. But Burke had spent his entire adult life taking calculated risks to get wealth and power, and his analysis convinced him that this was a risk worth taking. The planning part of the Lufthansa heist took several months and showed Burke's smart understanding of complicated criminal jobs. Instead of rushing into the theft, Burke carefully worked on every part of the job. Gathering information, picking the team, getting equipment, planning routes, and most importantly, planning for security after the heist. Burke's way of planning the Lufthansa heist showed lessons learned from decades of criminal experience and revealed the smart mind that had made him successful in the very competitive world of airport theft. He understood that the complexity of the job would need an unheard of amount of attention to detail, and that any missed detail could lead to disaster for everyone involved. The first challenge was picking the team. Burke needed a crew big enough to handle the physical work of the heist, but small enough to keep the job a secret. Each extra person added to both the team's abilities and the possible weak spots that could ruin the whole job. Burke spent a lot of time analyzing the skills, reliability, and mental state of possible crew members. Burke's final crew choices showed his deep understanding of criminal minds and what the job required. He chose people who had specific skills needed for the heist, while also being personally loyal to Burke, which would be very important after the heist. Each member of the crew had worked with Burke for several years and had shown they could handle high-stress jobs without getting themselves or their friends in trouble. Tommy DeSimone was chosen for his experience with violent fights and his willingness to use threats when needed to control situations, while Burke preferred to have as little violence as possible during his jobs. He knew that a theft this big might need the believable threat of violence to make sure victims complied and the crew stayed in line. Henry Hill's role was coordination and information, jobs that used his social skills and his detailed knowledge of Burke's work procedures. Hill would act as Burke's main helper during the job, handling communication between crew members and managing unexpected problems that might happen during the theft. The crew also included several specialists whose skills would be essential for specific parts of the job. There were drivers who could handle the complex airport road system under high-stress situations, lookouts who could give early warnings of police response, and muscle who could handle the physical work of moving large amounts of cash and goods. Burke's equipment planning was just as careful. The crew would need cars that were reliable, fast, and completely clean of any connections to their regular criminal work. Burke got several cars through other people, making sure that none could be traced back to him or his friends through registration records, previous owners, or repair histories. The choice of weapons showed Burke's preference for threats over violence. The crew would be armed with handguns and shotguns, enough to control any resistance they might face. But Burke specifically forbid the use of violence unless it was absolutely necessary for the crew's safety. He understood that a murder during a robbery would turn the crime from a property theft into a major case that would get the most police attention. Perhaps most importantly, Burke developed detailed backup plans for different things that might happen during the heist. He found multiple escape routes from the airport, set up alternate meeting points for crew members, and created plans for handling unexpected problems like the theft being discovered early or the police showing up too soon. The information gathering part of the planning process showed Burke's smart understanding of keeping jobs secret and his ability to manage complex information gathering through Werner and his other airport helpers. Burke got detailed floor plans of the Lufthansa cargo building, schedules for security patrols, information about alarm systems, and even personal details about night shift workers who would be there during the heist. This information gathering was not just about the immediate target. Burke also collected information about police response procedures, airport security rules, and even traffic patterns around JFK Airport during holiday weekends. He understood that the successful completion of the heist would depend on exact timing, combined with detailed knowledge of all factors that might affect the job. Burke's analysis of what to do for security after the heist was maybe the smartest part of his planning. He understood that the theft itself was only the start of the challenge. The real test would be to avoid getting caught during the investigation that would surely follow. Burke developed detailed plans for laundering the stolen cash, getting rid of evidence, and most importantly, making sure that everyone involved in the job stayed quiet. The money laundering plan involved a network of businesses and financial places that Burke had built up over many years of criminal jobs. Instead of trying to spend or invest large amounts of cash right away, Burke planned to move the money through real businesses over a period of several years, slowly turning it into what looked like legal income and investments. But Burke's most important post-heist planning was about managing the people, making sure that none of the participants in the heist would get themselves or their friends in trouble through careless behavior, too much spending, or working with the police. This part of the planning would, in the end, become the source of Burke's biggest challenges and his most talked about decisions. By the time Burke was ready to do the Lufthansa heist, he had created what was arguably the most thoroughly planned and professionally organized robbery in American criminal history. Every detail had been thought of, every possible problem had been planned for, and every person involved understood their role in a job that would either make them all richer than they could imagine or destroy them completely. The Lufthansa heist began in the early morning hours of December 11, 1978, when Burke's carefully chosen crew met at a planned location in Queens. The mood was tense but controlled. These were experienced criminals who understood that success would depend on discipline, timing, and following Burke's plan exactly. Burke's pre-job briefing was typically detailed and exact. He went over each crew member's jobs, confirmed timing and coordination plans, and stressed the importance of keeping violence to a minimum and maintaining secrecy. Most importantly, he reminded everyone that the real challenge would begin after the theft was done, avoiding being caught during the huge investigation that would surely follow. The crew left for JFK Airport in 2 cars, following carefully planned routes that avoided areas with a lot of police or security cameras. Burke had timed their arrival to happen during the shift change for airport security, a time when there would be few guards and attention would be on regular work tasks rather than security watching. Louis Werner's role as the inside helper proved to be very important during the approach part of the job. His detailed knowledge of security rules allowed the crew to enter the cargo area without setting off alarms or getting attention from the few workers present during the early morning shift. Werner's access codes and knowledge of the building's layout let the crew move directly to their target without wasting time looking around or trying different things. The Lufthansa cargo building at 3 a.m. was a huge, dimly lit space filled with containers, equipment, and the normal sounds of airport work. The crew moved through this place with professional skill, their movements coordinated and with purpose. Burke had trained them a lot on the layout and procedures, and their work showed months of careful preparation. The actual theft was even better than Burke's hopeful predictions. The crew found not only the cash shipment they expected, but also extra containers of jewelry and precious metals, whose value had not been in Werner's original information. The total amount would eventually be valued at about $6 million, making it the largest cash robbery in American history at that time. But Burke's happiness with the theft was balanced by his understanding of what would come next. As the crew loaded bags of cash and containers of jewelry into their cars, Burke was already thinking about the investigation that would begin within hours of their leaving. Every part of their job had been designed to leave as little evidence as possible and avoid being caught. But Burke knew that a theft this big would bring an unheard-of police response. The escape from JFK Airport went exactly as planned. The crew left through separate routes, following plans that would make it hard for investigators to figure out their movements or identify their cars. Burke had guessed that airport security cameras might get pictures of cars leaving the area, so the cars used for the heist had been gotten just for this job and would be gotten rid of right after. A time right after the heist showed both how well Burke's planning worked and the challenges that were still to come. The theft was not found until several hours after the crew had left, giving them valuable time to get to safe places and start their post-job security plans. But when the theft was discovered, the police response was exactly as massive and intense as Burke had predicted. Within 24 hours of the discovery, the FBI had put more than 100 agents on the Lufthansa investigation. The theft made the front page of newspapers across the country, and the huge amount of money involved guaranteed that the case would get the most attention from federal police agencies. Burke understood that everyone connected to the theft would be under intense watch for months or years to come. Burke's behavior in the days right after the Lufthansa heist showed both his criminal smarts and the mental pressure he was already feeling because of the job's success. While other members of the crew were celebrating their big win, Burke was focused on the dangerous time ahead, the months during which the police would carefully investigate every part of the theft. The first challenge was managing the stolen money itself. $6 million in cash was both a huge opportunity and a possibly deadly problem. Burke understood that the money could not be spent or invested right away without getting attention, but he also knew that holding on to it had ongoing security risks. His solution showed the smart thinking that had made him successful throughout his criminal career. Instead of trying to split the money right away among the crew members, Burke kept control of most of the cash while giving each person a small payment in advance. This method had several purposes. It made sure that crew members would not get themselves in trouble through sudden shows of wealth. It kept Burke in control of the group during the very important post-heist time, and it gave him power to enforce the security rules that would be essential for everyone's safety. Burke's management of the crew during this time showed his deep understanding of criminal minds and group behavior. He knew that the success of the heist would create mental pressures that could lead to careless behavior, too much confidence, or fights within the group that might risk the whole job. His response was to keep tight control over the crew's actions while giving enough financial reward to make sure they stayed loyal. His most immediate worry was stopping any crew member from acting in ways that might get police attention. Burke set strict rules about spending, travel, and social behavior, understanding that investigators would be looking for any signs of sudden wealth or changes in lifestyle among known criminals in the New York area. He also put in place communication rules designed to limit contact between crew members, while still being able to coordinate their actions if needed. Burke's paranoia during this time was not crazy. It was based on a correct understanding of the investigation that was already happening. FBI agents were doing interviews all over the criminal world, offering big rewards for information about the heist, and using surveillance to watch the activities of people they suspected. Burke knew that any mistake by any crew member could possibly get the whole group in trouble. The mental pressure of managing this situation was huge, even for someone with Burke's experience and emotional control. He was at the same time dealing with the excitement of having pulled off the biggest success of his criminal career, and the constant stress of knowing that dozens of federal agents were working around the clock to find and arrest everyone involved in the theft. But Burke's biggest challenge during this time was not the police. It was managing the hopes and behavior of his own crew members. The success of the Lufthansa heist had made everyone involved richer than they had ever dreamed. But it had also created pressures and temptations that threatened the safety of the whole job. Henry Hill, Burke's longtime partner and closest friend, was starting to act in ways that worried Burke a lot. Hill's natural friendliness, which had been a help during the planning and hiring parts of their criminal jobs, was becoming a problem in the post-heist world, where being quiet was essential for survival. Hill was talking too much, spending too freely, and getting exactly the kind of attention that Burke had warned everyone to avoid. Tommy DeSimone was a different but equally dangerous challenge. DeSimone's violent side, which Burke had carefully controlled during their criminal jobs, was becoming more unpredictable under the stress of the post-heist time. DeSimone was getting into fights and arguments that had nothing to do with the Lufthansa theft, but which could possibly bring police attention to the whole crew. Burke's solution to these challenges would in the end define the rest of his criminal career and make him known as one of the most cruel criminals in American history. But his decisions during this time did not come from being naturally evil or mean. They were the logical next step of the survival plans he had developed during his lonely childhood and his years in special schools. Burke had learned early in life that trust was a special treat he could not have, and that survival required total control over everyone and everything that could threaten his safety. The success of the Lufthansa heist had created a situation where other people's behavior could decide whether Burke lived as a rich man or died in federal prison. And his response to this situation was completely in line with the mental patterns that had defined his entire adult life. The weeks after the Lufthansa heist marked the start of a time that would change Jimmy Burke from a successful criminal into a legendary figure in American crime history. But this change would not come from more successful jobs or more criminal power. It would come from Burke's planned killing of everyone who had helped him achieve his biggest success. Burke's decision to start killing his Lufthansa partners was not made suddenly or with emotion. Instead, it was the result of a careful look at his post-heist situation and his conclusion that the people who knew about the Sauvage theft were unacceptable risks to his freedom and survival. This decision showed the same cold, logical thinking that had marked all of Burke's major criminal decisions. But doing it would show a capacity for long-lasting violence that surprised even those who knew him well. The first sign that Burke was thinking about extreme actions came in his talks with Henry Hill about post-heist rules. Hill later remembered that Burke seemed more and more worried about the behavior of other crew members and was making comments about the need for permanent solutions to security problems. At the time, Hill thought these were just what-if talks about made-up situations rather than specific plans for real violence. Burke's analysis of his post-heist situation was based on his understanding of federal investigation methods and his judgment of each crew member's reliability under pressure. He knew that FBI agents would eventually find most or all of the people involved in the theft through surveillance, informant reports, and a planned investigation of airport workers with access to the stolen cash. Once found, each person would face decades in federal prison unless they could give information that would shorten their sentences by working with prosecutors. The math of this situation was simple and terrifying. Burke's freedom depended on about a dozen people staying quiet, who were facing huge pressure to work with the police. Normal ways of ensuring silence, like giving money, making threats, or appealing to loyalty, might not be enough given how serious the charges were and the resources that federal investigators would use on the case. Burke's solution was typically direct and total. Get rid of everyone whose testimony could connect him to the Lufthansa heist. This was not a decision made in anger or panic, but a strategic choice based on Burke's judgment that murder was his most reliable way of ensuring long-term safety. The people who had made him rich had, because of what they knew, become threats to his survival. Carrying out this decision would take up the next several years of Burke's life and would, in the end, destroy everything he had spent decades building. But from Burke's point of view, in early 1979, it was the logical next step of the survival plans that had allowed him to do well in the violent world of organized crime for almost 30 years. Burke's first target was someone whose death would not be immediately connected to the Lufthansa heist by police investigators. This showed his understanding that a sudden wave of deaths among known criminals might alert authorities to the link between the victims and the airport theft. Instead, Burke planned to get rid of his partners slowly, using methods that would make their deaths look like they were caused by other unrelated criminal acts. The psychological change that Burke went through during this time was amazing for how complete it was and how much it matched his past behavior. The man who had earned the nickname Jimmy the Gent through decades of polite, professional criminal behavior was now planning the systematic murder of his closest partners. But this change was not a break from his past character. It was the final expression of the emotional distance and strategic thinking that had always defined his approach to criminal friendships. Burke had never formed real emotional bonds with his criminal partners. His friendships were always like business deals, based on what was good for both of them rather than real affection or loyalty. When the deal changed, when his partners became problems rather than assets, Burke's response was to change the terms of the friendship in the most permanent way possible. The stage was now set for one of the most famous killing sprees in American criminal history. Burke's systematic killing of the Lufthansa crew would make him a legendary figure in true crime history, but it would also seal his fate by creating the very police attention he was trying to avoid. The man who had survived 3 decades in the criminal world through careful planning and strategic thinking was about to destroy himself with the same methods that had made him successful. The change of Jimmy Burke from a successful criminal to a methodical killer began with the death of Tommy DeSimone in January 1979, though. The connection between DeSimone's murder and the Lufthansa heist would not be clear to the police until much later. DeSimone's death seemed to be the result of his ongoing fights with members of the Gambino crime family. But it was actually the first move in Burke's planned campaign to get rid of everyone who could connect him to the airport theft. DeSimone had become more and more unpredictable and violent in the weeks after the Lufthansa heist, getting into fights that threatened to bring unwanted attention to Burke's organization. More importantly, Burke had learned that DeSimone was being investigated by the FBI for several other murders, creating the chance that he might try to trade information about the Lufthansa heist for a lighter sentence in his own legal problems. Burke's decision to get rid of DeSimone was made with the same careful analysis that had marked all of his major criminal decisions. DeSimone's violent reputation and ongoing legal problems made him a natural target for being killed by other criminals, giving Burke cover for the murder. Also, DeSimone's death would send a message to other Lufthansa participants about the consequences of getting police attention or acting in ways that might put the group's safety at risk. The murder itself was carried out through Burke's connections within the Lucchese crime family, making sure that the killing could not be traced directly back to him. DeSimone was tricked into what he thought was a meeting about his possible entry into the Mafia, but was instead killed by partners who had been convinced that his continued survival was a threat to their organization. Burke's role in planning the murder was known only to a few high-level criminals who had their own reasons for wanting DeSimone gone. DeSimone's disappearance was at first thought to be because of his ongoing fights with rival crime families, and police investigators focused their attention on those known fights rather than looking for connections to the Lufthansa heist. This reaction confirmed Burke's belief that carefully planned murders could get rid of security risks without increasing police attention on his organization. The success of getting rid of DeSimone encouraged Burke to continue with his security plan, but it also started a mental process that would in the end consume him. Having crossed the line from theft to murder, Burke found it easier and easier to see violence as a solution to any problem that threatened his safety. Each successful killing made him less hesitant about more violence, while at the same time increasing his paranoia about possible threats. Burke's next target was Stax Edwards, a minor person in the Lufthansa heist whose careless behavior had already gotten FBI attention. Edwards had been responsible for getting rid of one of the cars used in the theft, but had failed to follow Burke's instructions completely. The car was found by the police with forensic evidence that could possibly be used to identify people in the heist. Edwards's mistake was exactly the kind of security problem that Burke had expected and planned for during the post-heist period. But Edwards's failure was not mean or on purpose. It was simply the result of not having enough experience in making a bad decision under pressure. From Burke's point of view, however, the reason for Edwards's mistake did not matter. What mattered was that Edwards had put the safety of the whole operation at risk and needed to be gotten rid of before he could cause more damage. The murder of Stax Edwards was more direct and brutal than getting rid of DeSimone. Edwards was shot multiple times in his apartment by partners acting on Burke's orders, and his body was left where it would be quickly found by the police. This method served several purposes. It got rid of Edwards as a security risk. It sent a clear message to other Lufthansa participants about the consequences of careless behavior. And it gave the police an obvious murder victim whose death could be investigated without necessarily connecting it to the airport theft. Burke's calculation proved correct in the short term. The Edwards murder was at first investigated as a drug-related killing, and police attention focused on Edwards's known friends in the drug trade, rather than his connections to airport theft. But the murder also marked an increase in Burke's violence that would eventually attract exactly the kind of attention he was trying to avoid. Throughout 1979 and 1980, Burke continued his planned killing of Lufthansa participants and anyone else whose knowledge was a possible threat to his safety. The murders were carried out using various methods and at different places, but they shared common features that showed Burke's strategic approach to violence and his understanding of police investigation methods. Each murder was planned to seem unrelated to the Lufthansa heist and to the other killings in the series. Burke used different methods, different locations, and different partners to carry out the murders, making it hard for investigators to find patterns that might connect the deaths to a single source. Some victims were shot, others were stabbed, and several simply disappeared without any trace of their bodies ever being found. The victims were also chosen based on how easy they were to get to and the chance that their deaths would be blamed on other causes. Burke targeted people with known enemies, ongoing legal problems, or involvement in dangerous criminal activities that would provide other explanations for their murders. This approach made sure that each death would start its own separate investigation, rather than being connected to a broader pattern of violence. But Burke's smartest insight was his understanding of the psychological effect that these murders would have on the surviving members of his organization. Each death sent a clear message about the consequences of being disloyal or careless, while the planned nature of the killings created a mood of terror that stopped anyone from thinking about working with the police. Louis Werner, the Lufthansa cargo supervisor, whose inside information had made the heist possible, became more and more paranoid as his partners began to disappear. Werner understood that his detailed knowledge of the theft and his job at the airport made him both valuable and dangerous to Burke's organization. He began taking fancy security measures, changing his daily routines, and avoiding contact with anyone connected to the criminal world. But Werner's precautions could not protect him from Burke's reach within the criminal community. In May 1979, Werner was found dead in his car in a parking lot at JFK Airport, killed by a single gunshot to the head. The location of the murder was symbolic, a message to other airport employees who might be thinking about working with the police about the consequences of betraying Burke's organization. Werner's murder was particularly important because it showed Burke's willingness to get rid of even those people whose survival might be good for his organization. Werner's position at the airport and his detailed knowledge of cargo operations could have been valuable for future criminal jobs. But Burke's analysis concluded that Werner's risk as a potential government witness was greater than his value as a criminal asset. The elimination of Werner also marked a turning point in the police investigation of the Lufthansa heist. FBI agents had been watching Werner as a possible source of information about the theft, and his murder confirmed their suspicions that someone was systematically getting rid of witnesses. This realization led to increased protection for surviving witnesses and a more intense investigation of connections between the various murders and the airport theft. Burke's behavior during this period showed the psychological toll of his systematic murder campaign and the increasing paranoia that was driving his decisions. Partners who had known him for decades reported that he had become suspicious, quiet, and unpredictably violent. The controlled, professional manner that had marked his criminal career was being replaced by erratic behavior that reflected the enormous stress he was under. The success of Burke's murder campaign had gotten rid of many of the immediate threats to his security, but it had also created new problems that were harder to manage. Each murder started its own police investigation, increasing the overall level of police attention on Burke and his organization. Also, the pattern of deaths was beginning to attract attention from FBI analysts, who specialized in finding connections between apparently unrelated crimes. Burke's response to these new challenges was typically direct. He expanded his murder campaign to include anyone whose knowledge or behavior might possibly threaten his security. This expansion showed both his growing paranoia and his increasing confidence in his ability to solve problems with violence. But it also marked the beginning of a spiral of violence that would ultimately destroy everything he had worked to build. The targets of Burke's expanded campaign included not only direct participants in the Lufthansa heist, but also their family members, partners, and anyone else who might have indirect knowledge of the crime or the murders that followed. This broader campaign showed his understanding that knowledge of his activities could spread through criminal and family networks in ways that were hard to predict or control. Martin Krugman, a bookie who had helped Burke launder some of the Lufthansa money, disappeared in January 1980 in a way that clearly pointed to murder. Krugman had no direct part in the heist itself, but his financial services had been essential for turning the stolen cash into what looked like legal assets. Burke's decision to get rid of Krugman showed his recognition that even being slightly involved in his criminal activities could create security risks that needed permanent solutions. Teresa Ferrara, the girlfriend of another Lufthansa participant, was found murdered in her apartment in March 1980. Ferrara had no direct knowledge of the heist, but Burke suspected that her boyfriend might have told her details about the crime during private conversations. Her murder sent a chilling message to the criminal community about Burke's willingness to get rid of anyone whose knowledge might be even a theoretical threat to his security. These expanded murders showed Burke's change from a logical criminal planner into a paranoid killer who saw threats everywhere and now responded to those perceived threats with automatic violence. A psychological process that had begun with the justified killing of real security. Risks had turned into a compulsive pattern of murder that was driven more by paranoia than by strategic need. Throughout this period of systematic violence, Burke's relationship with Henry Hill remained his most complex and dangerous challenge. Hill had been Burke's closest associate and most trusted partner for nearly 2 decades, making him both the most valuable and the most dangerous member of Burke's organization. Hill's detailed knowledge of Burke's criminal activities went far, beyond the Lufthansa heist to include almost every major crime Burke had committed since the 1960s, but Hill's behavior in the aftermath of the Lufthansa heist had become increasingly problematic. From Burke's perspective, Hill was spending money too freely, talking too openly about his criminal activities, and getting involved in drug dealing, operations that broke traditional Mafia rules and attracted unwanted law enforcement attention. Most importantly, Hill's lifestyle and legal problems were creating exactly the kind of pressure that might lead him to cooperate with federal prosecutors. Burke's analysis of the Hill situation was complicated by a genuine emotional attachment that was unusual for him. Despite his general inability to form authentic personal relationships, Burke had developed something close to real affection for Hill over their years of partnership. Hill's loyalty, competence, and shared experiences had created a bond that was stronger than the purely business-like relationships Burke had with most of his associates. But Burke's emotional attachment to Hill was ultimately less important than his commitment to his own survival. As Hill's behavior became more erratic and his legal problems more serious, Burke began to consider the possibility that eliminating Hill might be necessary for his own security. This consideration was one of the most difficult decisions of Burke's criminal career. but it was entirely consistent with the survival strategies that had guided his behavior since childhood. The thing that made Burke make his final decision about Hill came when Burke learned that Hill was being investigated by federal agents for drug trafficking charges that were unrelated to the Lufthansa heist. These charges carried potential sentences that were severe enough to give Hill strong reasons to cooperate with prosecutors. And Hill's detailed knowledge of Burke's activities made him an extremely valuable potential witness. Burke's initial response was to try to manage Hill's situation through traditional methods. He gave Hill money for legal expenses, connected him with experienced criminal attorneys, and offered help with the practical problems that Hill was facing because of his legal troubles. But Burke also began developing backup plans for eliminating Hill, if these supportive measures proved to be not enough. The decision to kill Henry Hill was the ultimate expression of Burke's psychological evolution from a lonely child seeking security to a paranoid killer who trusted no one completely. Hill had been his closest friend, most reliable partner, and most loyal associate for nearly 20 years. But when Hill's continued survival became incompatible with Burke's security, Burke began planning his murder with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized all of his criminal operations. The irony of this situation was that Hill's loyalty to Burke was genuine and probably would have survived even the enormous pressure of a federal prosecution. Hill had participated in dozens of crimes with Burke over 2 decades and had never shown any desire to cooperate with law enforcement or betray his criminal associates. But Burke's paranoia had reached a level where even genuine loyalty was not enough to assure trust. The planning for Hill's murder showed Burke's sophisticated understanding of both criminal operations and law enforcement investigation procedures. Hill would have to be eliminated in a way that would not immediately connect his death to the Lufthansa investigation, but which would send a clear message to any other potential witnesses about the consequences of cooperating with federal authorities. But Burke's plan to eliminate Hill would ultimately fail, not because of poor planning or operational problems, but because Hill finally recognized the reality of his situation and made the decision that would destroy Burke's criminal empire forever. The man who had never betrayed a friend in 20 years of criminal partnership would ultimately become the witness whose testimony would send Burke to prison for the rest of his life. Henry Hill's decision to cooperate with the FBI in May 1980 meant the collapse of everything Jimmy Burke had spent 3 decades building. The decision did not come easily or suddenly. It was the result of Hill's growing realization that his continued loyalty to Burke would likely lead to his own death, and his final recognition that the friendship he had valued for 20 years had become a one-way relationship based on fear rather than mutual respect. The immediate reason for Hill's cooperation was his arrest on drug charges that carried a potential sentence of 25 years to life under New York's harsh drug laws. But the deeper reason was Hill's understanding, gained through conversations with other criminals and careful observation of Burke's recent behavior, that he had become a target for elimination despite his decades of loyalty and service to Burke's organization. Hill's change from a loyal criminal partner to a government witness was mentally painful for him, but it was also strategically devastating for Burke. Hill had detailed knowledge of almost every major crime Burke had committed since the early 1960s, including not only the Lufthansa heist, but also dozens of other thefts, several murders, and the complex network of corruption that had allowed Burke's organization to operate without much punishment for years. The FBI agents who questioned Hill were amazed by how much he knew about Burke's criminal activities. Hill could provide specific dates, locations, methods, and participants for crimes spanning nearly 2 decades. He had detailed information about Burke's relationships with organized crime figures, corrupt law enforcement officials, and legitimate businessmen who had helped with criminal operations. Most importantly, he could provide insider testimony about Burke's role in planning and executing the Lufthansa heist and his later murder of participants in the theft. Hill's cooperation with federal authorities was done under extreme security measures that showed both the value of his testimony and the real danger he faced from Burke's organization. Hill and his family were placed in the Federal Witness Protection Program, given new identities, and moved to areas where Burke's criminal network could not reach them. These precautions were necessary because Hill's betrayal was a huge threat to Burke's freedom that would certainly provoke a violent response. Burke's reaction to Hill's cooperation was at first disbelief, then anger, and finally a calculated assessment of the damage that Hill's testimony could cause to his organization. Burke had always understood that betrayal was a possibility in the criminal world, but he had convinced himself that Hill's genuine loyalty and their shared history would make such a betrayal impossible. The realization that he had been wrong about Hill's character forced Burke to face the possibility that he had been wrong about many other basic beliefs that had guided his criminal career. But Burke's more immediate concern was limiting the damage that Hill's testimony could cause to his organization and his own chances of avoiding prosecution. Hill's detailed knowledge meant that traditional ways of discrediting witnesses, like challenging their credibility, questioning their motives, or attacking their character, would not be enough if Hill could provide evidence or support from other sources for his testimony. Burke's response was characteristically thorough and ruthless. He began systematically eliminating anyone who might be able to support Hill's testimony, while at the same time trying to find and eliminate Hill himself, despite the federal protection he was receiving. This escalated campaign of violence was Burke's final attempt to maintain control over his worsening situation. But it also gave federal investigators more evidence of his criminal activities and his willingness to commit murder to avoid prosecution. The FBI investigation that followed Hill's cooperation was one of the largest and most intense criminal investigations in the FBI's history. More than 200 federal agents were assigned to various parts of the case, and the investigation ultimately expanded to include not only the Lufthansa Heist, but also dozens of other crimes connected to Burke's organization. The scope and intensity of this investigation showed both the significance of the crimes involved and the unprecedented level of insider information that Hill was providing to prosecutors. The investigation revealed the sophisticated nature of Burke's criminal organization and the extensive network of corruption that had enabled its operations. Federal agents discovered that Burke's influence extended throughout the airport, into various levels of law enforcement, and into legitimate businesses that had served as fronts for criminal activities. The investigation also revealed the systematic nature of Burke's murder campaign and provided evidence connecting him to more than a dozen killings over a 2-year period. Burke's response to the intensifying investigation was a combination of legal tricks and continued violence. He hired experienced criminal attorneys who specialized in defending organized crime cases while at the same time continuing his attempts to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence that might be used against him. But Burke's options were becoming more and more limited as federal investigators systematically took apart the network of relationships and resources that had supported his criminal career. The legal strategy used by Burke's attorneys showed their understanding that normal defense methods would not be enough given the amount of evidence against him. Instead of denying Burke's involvement in criminal activities, the defense focused on challenging the credibility of government witnesses, questioning the methods used by federal investigators, and arguing that Burke was being unfairly targeted because of his reputation, rather than solid evidence of specific crimes. But the prosecution's case was built on more than just Hill's testimony. Federal investigators had spent months developing physical evidence, financial records, and supporting testimony from other witnesses that backed up Hill's account of Burke's criminal activities. The prosecution team included experienced attorneys who specialized in organized crime cases and who understood the Challenges involved in prosecuting sophisticated criminals with extensive resources and connections. The pre-trial period showed how much Burke's paranoia had damaged his relationships throughout the criminal community. Many of his former associates refused to help with his legal defense, either because they feared becoming targets for elimination themselves, or because they had lost confidence in Burke's ability to protect them from law enforcement. This isolation left Burke increasingly dependent on his own resources and a shrinking circle of loyal supporters. Burke's behavior during this period showed the enormous psychological pressure he was under as his carefully built world collapsed around him. Associates reported that he had become increasingly erratic and unpredictable, switching between periods of confident defiance and moments of apparent despair. The controlled, professional manner that had characterized his criminal career was being replaced by the behavior of a man who recognized that his life as he had known it was ending. Jimmy Burke's trial for his role in the Lufthansa Heist and the murders that followed began in September 1982 and immediately got national media attention. The case was more than just the prosecution of a single criminal. It was seen as a test of the federal government's ability to successfully prosecute sophisticated organized crime operations and a demonstration of how effective witness protection programs were in encouraging cooperation with law enforcement. The prosecution's opening statement painted Burke as the mastermind behind the largest cash robbery in American history and the systematic murder of his own criminal associates. Prosecutors described Burke's transformation from a successful criminal to a paranoid killer, using Hill's testimony and supporting evidence to build a complete story of criminal conspiracy, theft, and murder that spanned more than 2 decades. Burke's defense team tried to portray him as a scapegoat being unfairly targeted by overeager federal prosecutors, who were more interested in making headlines than in pursuing justice. The defense argued that Hill's testimony was unreliable because of his own criminal background and his motive to cooperate with authorities to avoid prosecution for his own crimes. They also challenged the methods used by federal investigators and argued that much of the evidence against Burke had been obtained through illegal surveillance and improper investigative techniques. But the prosecution's case was methodically built and well supported by physical evidence, financial records, and testimony from multiple witnesses. Hill's testimony provided the story's framework for the prosecution's case, but his account was supported by documents, forensic analysis, and testimony from other witnesses who could confirm specific details of the crimes involved. The most painful moments of the trial came during Hill's testimony, when he provided detailed accounts of his 20-year partnership with Burke and his insider knowledge of the Lufthansa heist and the murders that followed. Hill's testimony was powerful, not only because of its detail and specificity, but also because of the obvious psychological difficulty he had in betraying someone who had been both his closest friend and his greatest fear. Burke's reaction to Hill's testimony was carefully controlled, but observers noted that he appeared genuinely surprised by some of the details that Hill revealed about their shared criminal activities. This reaction suggested that even Burke had not fully understood the extent to which Hill had been observing and remembering their criminal operations over the years. The trial also featured testimony from surviving members of Burke's organization who had been granted immunity in exchange for their cooperation with prosecutors. These witnesses provided additional confirmation of Hill's account and helped prosecutors establish the systematic nature of Burke's criminal activities and his role as the leader of a sophisticated criminal organization. Burke's decision not to testify in his own defense was strategic, but it also showed his recognition that being cross-examined would likely reveal more evidence of his criminal activities. Burke's attorneys understood that their client's intelligence and criminal sophistication, which had been strengths throughout his career, would likely work against him in a courtroom where the jury's sympathy was an important factor. The prosecution's closing argument emphasized the scope and brutality of Burke's crimes, particularly his systematic murder of the people who had helped him achieve his greatest criminal success. Prosecutors argued that Burke was a unique threat to society because of his combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and complete lack of loyalty to anyone other than himself. The jury's verdict was delivered after 3 days of deliberation. Guilty on all counts, including conspiracy, theft, and multiple counts of murder. Burke's conviction was one of the most significant victories in the federal government's campaign against organized crime, and showed the effectiveness of witness protection programs in encouraging cooperation from insider witnesses. Burke's sentencing hearing gave the families of his victims an opportunity to describe the impact of his crimes on their lives. The testimony from these families revealed the human cost of Burke's criminal career and the devastating effects of his violence on innocent people who had been connected to his victims. This testimony was particularly powerful because it showed that Burke's crimes had affected not only other criminals but also law-abiding citizens who had been caught up in his web of violence. Burke was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that reflected both the severity of his crimes and the court's assessment that he was a continuing danger to society. The judge's sentencing statement emphasized Burke's systematic betrayal of the people who had trusted him and his complete lack of remorse for the devastation he had caused. But Burke's conviction was only the beginning of the legal consequences that came from Hill's cooperation and the FBI investigation it had started. Federal and state prosecutors used the information developed during the Burke investigation to pursue cases against dozens of other criminals who had been part of his organization or who had helped his operations over the years. The investigation also led to the exposure and prosecution of corrupt law enforcement officials, judges, and business leaders who had facilitated Burke's criminal operations over the years. The scope of this corruption surprised even experienced federal investigators and revealed how much organized crime had infiltrated legitimate institutions in the New York area. Burke's adjustment to life in federal prison was complicated by his reputation and the continuing threats he faced from associates, who blamed him for the destruction of their criminal organization. The federal prison system housed Burke in maximum security facilities, where his movements were carefully monitored and his contacts with other inmates were limited, as much for his own protection as for the prison's security. But prison life could not completely contain Burke's criminal instincts or his need to maintain control over his environment. Within months of his imprisonment, Burke had established himself as a significant figure within the prison's informal power structure. He used his intelligence, his experience with criminal organization, and his reputation for violence to build influence among other inmates and even some correctional staff. Burke's prison activities included loan sharking among inmates, organizing gambling operations, and helping communication between incarcerated criminals and their associates on the outside. These activities were relatively minor compared to his previous criminal enterprises, but they showed that imprisonment had not fundamentally changed his approach to social relationships or his need to dominate his environment. The psychological impact of imprisonment on Burke was complex and changed over the years he spent in custody. Initially, he seemed to maintain the controlled, calculating demeanor that had characterized his criminal career. He followed prison rules when it served his purposes, maintained his physical fitness, and continued to study law and criminal procedure in the prison library. But as the years passed and the reality of life imprisonment became more apparent, Burke began to show signs of the emotional isolation that had always characterized his relationships with other people. He had few visitors, corresponded with almost no one from his previous life, and showed little interest in the rehabilitation programs that were available to long-term inmates. Burke's reputation within the federal prison system was that of an intelligent but dangerous inmate who required careful monitoring but who generally followed institutional rules. His criminal sophistication made him a natural leader among other inmates, but his history of betrayal and violence also made other prisoners wary of becoming too closely associated with him. The contrast between Burke's prison reputation and his previous criminal status was remarkable. The man who had once commanded the loyalty and respect of dozens of professional criminals was now isolated within a system where his past achievements were meaningless and his future prospects were non-existent. Burke's later years in prison were marked by declining health, increasing isolation, and occasional moments of reflection on the criminal career that had brought him to federal custody. He developed heart problems that required ongoing medical treatment, and his physical condition gradually worsened despite his efforts to maintain his fitness through prison exercise programs. But Burke's mental abilities remained sharp throughout his imprisonment, and he continued to follow developments in organized crime and law enforcement through prison newsletters, legal publications, and conversations with other inmates. He was particularly interested in cases involving former associates and in changes to federal criminal law that might have affected his own prosecution. Burke's few recorded comments about his criminal career and its consequences revealed a man who understood the choices he had made, but who showed little genuine remorse for the harm he had caused to others. He occasionally expressed regret about specific tactical decisions, particularly his systematic murder of the Lufthansa participants. But these regrets seemed to be based more on their practical consequences than on moral considerations. In one of his few extensive interviews, conducted by a criminal justice researcher in 1991, Burke reflected on the psychological factors that had shaped his criminal career. He acknowledged that his childhood experiences of abandonment and being in institutions had influenced his adult relationships, but he rejected suggestions that these experiences excused or explained his criminal behavior. "Everyone makes choices," Burke said during this interview. "I made mine based on what I thought would give me the best chance of survival and success. Some of those choices worked out, and some didn't. But they were my choices, and I accept responsibility for the consequences." This statement revealed both Burke's continued intelligence and his fundamental inability to understand the moral aspects of his criminal activities. Even after more than a decade in prison, he continued to view his life as a series of strategic decisions rather than as a pattern of choices that had caused enormous harm to other people. Burke's relationship with Henry Hill remained a source of particular bitterness throughout his imprisonment. Hill's cooperation had not only destroyed Burke's criminal organization, but had also made Hill wealthy and famous through book and movie deals that told the story of their criminal partnership. Burke viewed Hill's success as a personal betrayal that went beyond mere cooperation with law enforcement. "Henry got rich telling stories about our life," Burke commented in 1993. "He made millions of dollars from betraying people who trusted him. That's worse than anything I ever did, because at least I was honest about what I was." This comment revealed Burke's continued inability to understand the moral complexity of his situation. He could recognize Hill's financial success as a form of betrayal, but he could not acknowledge that his own systematic murder of criminal associates represented a more fundamental betrayal of trust and loyalty. Jimmy Burke died in federal custody on April 13, 1996, at the age of 64. The cause of death was officially listed as complications from lung cancer, but prison medical records also noted the effects of heart disease and other health problems that had developed during his years of imprisonment. Burke had spent the final 14 years of his life in federal prison, and he died without experiencing another day freedom after his conviction in 1982. Burke's death received relatively little media attention compared to the extensive coverage his criminal career had received during the 1970s and 1980s. By 1996, the Lufthansa Heist was primarily remembered as a historical oddity, and Burke himself was seen as a relic of an earlier era of organized crime that had been largely dismantled by federal prosecution efforts. But Burke's death marked the end of a criminal career that had spanned more than 4 decades and had significantly influenced the development of organized crime in the United States. His innovations in airport theft, his systematic approach to criminal organization, and his willingness to use extreme violence to maintain control had established patterns that continued to influence criminal behavior long after his imprisonment. The immediate aftermath of Burke's death revealed the extent of his isolation during his final years. He had few visitors during his final illness, and his funeral was attended by only a handful of distant relatives and former associates. The man who had once commanded the loyalty and respect of dozens of professional criminals died largely alone and unmourned. But Burke's death also provided an opportunity for law enforcement officials, criminal justice scholars, and journalists to assess his impact on American crime and to consider the lessons his career might offer for understanding criminal behavior and effective law enforcement strategies. FBI agents who had investigated Burke's organization noted that his systematic approach to criminal planning and execution had influenced the development of federal organized crime investigation techniques. The methods used to build cases against Burke, particularly the use of insider witnesses and the systematic analysis of financial records, became standard procedures for investigating sophisticated criminal organizations. Criminal justice scholars were particularly interested in Burke's psychological profile and the factors that had enabled him to maintain successful criminal operations for more than 3 decades. Studies of Burke's career contributed to the academic understanding of criminal leadership, organizational behavior in illegal enterprises, and the psychological factors that influence long-term criminal success and failure. Perhaps the most significant aspect of Burke's legacy was his influence on popular culture's understanding of organized crime and professional criminals. The story of Burke's criminal career, particularly the Lufthansa Heist and its aftermath, became the basis for numerous books, documentaries, and films that shaped the public's perception of criminal behavior and law enforcement. Henry Hill's cooperation with law enforcement had provided the detailed insider information necessary to tell Burke's story from the perspective of a participant rather than an outside observer. Hill's accounts of his criminal partnership with Burke revealed the day-to-day reality of professional crime in ways that previous accounts had not captured. And these revelations influenced the popular understanding of how criminal organizations actually functioned. The most famous cultural representation of Burke's story was the 1990 film Goodfellas, directed by Martin Scorsese and based on Nicholas Pileggi's book Wise Guy, which was itself based primarily on Hill's testimony interviews. In the film, Burke was portrayed as Jimmy Conway, a character who embodied both the charm and the ruthlessness that had characterized Burke's actual criminal career. The film's portrayal of Burke was notably accurate in its depiction of his transformation from a successful criminal to a paranoid killer, and it captured the psychological dynamics that had driven his systematic murder of the Lufthansa participants. The film also accurately portrayed Burke's relationship with Hill and the personal betrayal that Hill's cooperation represented from Burke's perspective. But the film's focus on the dramatic and violent aspects of Burke's story inevitably simplified the complex psychological and social factors that had shaped his criminal career. The real Burke was a more sophisticated and calculating figure than his movie representation suggested, and his criminal success was based on intelligence and strategic thinking rather than just charm and violence. The cultural impact of Burke's story extended beyond entertainment into academic and policy discussions about crime and punishment. Criminal justice reformers used Burke's case to argue for the effectiveness of witness protection programs and the Importance of federal resources for investigating organized crime. Law enforcement officials used Burke's career as an example of the need for sophisticated investigative techniques and interagency cooperation in combating professional criminals. But Burke's story also raised troubling questions about the moral complexity of criminal justice and the costs of effective law enforcement. Hill's cooperation with authorities had been essential for prosecuting Burke and dismantling his criminal organization. But it had also enabled Hill to profit financially from his criminal experiences while avoiding the consequences that had befallen his former associates. Looking back at Jimmy Burke's complete criminal career, from his abandoned childhood to his death in federal prison, several patterns emerge that help explain both his extraordinary criminal success and his ultimate downfall. Burke was undoubtedly one of the most intelligent and sophisticated criminals of his time, possessing organizational skills, strategic thinking abilities, and psychological insights that would have made him successful in any field he had chosen to enter. But Burke's criminal success was built on fundamental psychological and emotional limitations that ultimately made his downfall inevitable. His inability to form genuine human relationships, his compulsive need to control everyone around him, and his paranoid belief that survival required the elimination of anyone who might pose a threat created a dynamic that could only end in isolation and destruction. The systematic murder of the Lufthansa participants was the logical conclusion of the survival strategies that Burke had developed during his institutionalized childhood and adolescence. Having learned that trust was dangerous and that other people were ultimately unreliable, Burke responded to the pressure of the post-heist period by eliminating the source of that pressure, the people whose knowledge made them dangerous to him. But this response, while consistent with Burke's psychological patterns, was ultimately self-defeating. The murders attracted exactly the kind of law enforcement attention that Burke was trying to avoid, and they created the conditions that led Hill to cooperate with federal authorities. Burke's greatest strength, his ability to analyze situations rationally and respond strategically, became his greatest weakness when the analysis led him to destroy the relationships that had made his criminal success possible. Burke's story also illustrates the broader social costs of organized crime and the complex relationship between individual criminal behavior and larger social problems. Burke's criminal career was enabled by corruption in legitimate institutions, economic opportunities created by legal restrictions on certain activities, and social conditions that produced both criminals and victims. The investigation and prosecution of Burke's organization revealed the extent to which organized crime had penetrated legitimate businesses, law enforcement agencies, and political institutions in the New York area. The resources required to investigate and prosecute Burke's crimes showed both the social costs of allowing sophisticated criminal organizations to operate and the practical challenges involved in effective law enforcement responses. But perhaps the most important lesson of Burke's story is the demonstration that criminal success, no matter how sophisticated or long-lasting, ultimately contains the seeds of its own destruction. Burke's paranoid need to control everyone around him made it impossible for him to maintain the relationships that were essential for his continued success and security. The man who had survived poverty, abandonment, institutionalization, and 3 decades of criminal competition was ultimately defeated by his own inability to trust the people who had helped him achieve his greatest success. Burke's transformation from Jimmy the Gent to a systematic killer represented not just a moral failure, but a strategic miscalculation that destroyed everything he had spent his life building. In the end, Jimmy Burke's story serves as both a fascinating chronicle of criminal sophistication and a cautionary tale about the psychological costs of a life built on violence, deception, and betrayal. His extraordinary criminal success was matched only by the completeness of his ultimate failure, and his legacy remains a complex testament to both human intelligence and human destructiveness. Burke died as he had lived, alone, suspicious, and surrounded by the consequences of choices that had prioritized survival over all other considerations. The abandoned child who had learned to trust no one had ultimately become a man who could be trusted by no one, and his criminal empire collapsed under the weight of the paranoia and violence that had once seemed to be its greatest strengths. The story of Jimmy Burke is ultimately a story about the price of power without principle, intelligence without wisdom, and success without genuine human connection. It remains one of the most compelling and instructive criminal cases in America. History, offering insights into the nature of criminal behavior, the effectiveness of law enforcement strategies, and the complex relationship between individual choices and social consequences. His legacy continues to influence discussions about crime and punishment, criminal justice policy, and the social factors that produce both criminals and victims. His story reminds us that criminal behavior, no matter how sophisticated or successful, ultimately has costs that extend far beyond the immediate participants, and that the pursuit of power and wealth through violence and deception inevitably leads to isolation and destruction. The complete story of Jimmy Burke, from abandoned child to criminal mastermind to paranoid killer to forgotten prisoner, stands as one of the most remarkable and instructive criminal biographies in American history. It is a story that continues to fascinate and horrify, to educate and to warn, and to remind us of both the potential and the limitations of human intelligence when it is divorced from human compassion and moral understanding. In the gray hallways of federal prison, where Jimmy Burke spent his final years, there were no gentlemen and no gents, only numbers, routines, and the slow passing of time toward an unavoidable death. The man who had once commanded respect through a combination of intelligence, violence, and carefully calculated charm had been reduced to federal prisoner number 76456-053, known mostly for his declining health and his isolation from the world he had once dominated. Burke's death in 1996 marked not just the end of a life, but the closing of a chapter in American criminal history. The era of independent criminal operators, like Burke, intelligent, sophisticated, and capable of building and maintaining complex criminal organizations over decades, had largely ended with the expansion of federal law enforcement capabilities and the development of investigative techniques that made long-term criminal success increasingly difficult. Burke's story continues to be interesting because it sheds light on fundamental truths about human nature, criminal behavior, and the social conditions that produce both extraordinary criminal success and inevitable criminal failure. His career demonstrated that intelligence, strategic thinking, and organizational ability could enable remarkable criminal achievements. But it also showed that these same qualities could lead to self-destruction when they were separated from genuine human connection and moral understanding. The ultimate irony of Burke's story is that his greatest criminal success, the Lufthansa Heist, became the reason for his downfall, not because of a law enforcement investigation or a mistake in the operation, but because of his systematic betrayal of the people who had made that success possible. The man who had earned his reputation through the careful cultivation of criminal relationships destroyed himself by methodically eliminating those relationships when they became a problem. Burke's transformation from a successful criminal to a paranoid killer revealed the psychological limitations that had always held back his criminal achievements. His inability to trust others completely, his compulsive need to control his environment, and his willingness to use violence as a solution to complex human problems had served him well during his rise to criminal fame. But they made it impossible for him to maintain the relationships and organizational structures necessary for long-term success. The lesson of Jimmy Burke's story is not that crime doesn't pay. For nearly 30 years, crime paid Burke very well indeed. The lesson is that criminal success built on violence, deception, and betrayal inevitably leads to isolation and destruction, regardless of the intelligence or sophistication of the criminal involved. Burke's story also illustrates the broader social costs of organized crime and the importance of effective law enforcement responses to sophisticated criminal organizations. The investigation and prosecution of Burke's crimes required enormous resources and showed both the challenges and the necessity of combating professional criminals who possess significant intelligence, resources, and organizational capabilities. But perhaps the most important aspect of Burke's legacy is its demonstration of human potential and human limitation. Burke possessed extraordinary intelligence, remarkable organizational abilities, and a sophisticated understanding of human psychology, qualities that could have made him successful in virtually any legitimate field he had chosen to enter. The tragedy of Burke's story is not that he was inherently evil or naturally criminal, but that his early experiences of abandonment and institutionalization had taught him survival strategies that made genuine human connection impossible, and that ultimately led to his destruction of everyone who tried to help him achieve his goals. Jimmy Burke died as he had lived, alone, suspicious, and surrounded by the consequences of choices that had prioritized immediate survival over long-term relationships and personal security over human connection. His story remains a compelling reminder that intelligence without wisdom, success without principle, and power without compassion inevitably lead to isolation and failure. The complete story of Jimmy the Gent Burke stands as one of the most instructive criminal biographies in American history, offering insights into the nature of criminal behavior, the psychology of leadership and betrayal, and the complex relationship between individual choices and social consequences. It is a story that continues to fascinate and educate, to warn and to remind us of both the potential and the limitations of human intelligence when it is used in service of destruction rather than creation. In the end, Burke's greatest crime was not theft or murder, but the systematic destruction of trust and loyalty in pursuit of a security that proved to be an illusion. His story serves as a permanent reminder that true security can never be achieved through the elimination of human connection, and that genuine success requires not just intelligence and determination, but the wisdom to understand that our greatest achievements are always dependent on our relationships with other people. The gentleman criminal is dead, but the lessons of his extraordinary and ultimately tragic life remain as relevant today as they were during the height of his criminal career. His story continues to serve as both a fascinating chronicle of criminal sophistication and a cautionary tale about the human costs of choosing power over principle and survival over trust. Jimmy Burke's story reminds us that in the criminal underworld, loyalty is temporary, but consequences are forever. The man who turned theft into art and betrayal into business ultimately discovered that no amount of intelligence or careful planning can protect you from the enemies you create along the way. What did you think of Burke's transformation from an abandoned child to a criminal mastermind? Was he a product of his circumstances, or simply a man who chose power over principle at every turn? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of America's most notorious criminal minds, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the dark side of history. Ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest true crime masterpieces. His legacy lives on as both a cautionary tale and a masterclass in how paranoia can destroy everything you've worked to build. The gentleman criminal may be gone, but the lessons of his rise and fall remain as relevant today as they were in the shadows of Queens, where it all began.